Hey everyone, welcome to the CSI Secret Store community call. Today is the September 21st, 2023. This call will be recorded and published to YouTube, and it follows the CNCF Code of Conduct. Before we jump into the agenda, I think I already posted this on Slack. We have moved this meeting series, the bi-weekly series, by a week so that it alternates with the SIGOT bi-weekly series. And we have also changed the time from 8 a.m. PST to 9 a.m. PST. If you haven't added your names to the attendee list, please go ahead and do so. And in terms of moderating, I can help moderate. And I think the next time onwards, I will also ask before the call if anyone else wants to volunteer, just in case. But for notes, anyone who wants to help out this time with notes?
I'll do it.
Thank you, Bilal. Okay, the first one is the sync secret proposal. So I think it was on the agenda last time, but we didn't have everyone on the call. So, oh wow, it opens this way. Yeah. That was not readable at all.
The wonders of random new Google Docs features.
Yeah. Andrea, is this something that you want to walk us through?
Sure. So maybe we can start with the diagram that kind of explains what we're thinking of. I don't know if it's visible.
Can folks see this? Like I zoomed in, but
no, it's super pixelated.
It's tiny.
Good.
I was going to ask real quick, have we in this meeting, I don't think we have, but have we in this meeting discussed that this design basically replaces all other plans?
Nope.
Okay. So maybe we should talk about that too at some point today.
Okay. Yeah, I think we talked about it only in the SIGOT call, not in this one.
Yeah, so basically like Mo mentioned, what we proposed in the previous meetings using a caching system for the CSI driver to provide offline
Andrea,
support. Yes.
just a sec. Sorry, your voice is kind of unclear to me. I'm not sure if it's just me, but I'm having a hard time to understand.
I thought I could understand her, but maybe it was
okay. No, that's fine. Then we can continue. It's all right.
I'm sorry.
This is much better.
Okay. So the whole idea of using caches for the offline mode for the CSI driver got replaced with we're not going to provide offline support for the CSI driver. Instead, we're going to provide a synchronization controller that is going to synchronize the secrets as Kubernetes secrets. And with this, we also plan the CSI driver and let the CSI driver do what it was meant to do from the beginning, just mounting CSI volumes. And in the diagram, basically, I was trying to present what the flow is going to be for this new sync controller and what are the additional custom resource definitions that the user has to create. And also, I wanted to underline the fact that we are still using the secret provider class because we want to be compatible with the CSI driver, meaning we want to allow the users to deploy both the CSI driver and this new controller that does the secret synchronization.
Yeah, I think this diagram needs a little update because with the controller, we don't need the kubelet and all of it. But
yeah.
Yeah, and then just to add to what Andrea said, like I think Amit, you were on the last call too. So we presented the idea of supporting disconnected scenarios in the CSI driver, but that involved caching using like custom resources so that it was available for all the driver pods that were running. And then when we talked about it in the SIGOT call, the concern was that would violate node isolation. And then we talked about it at length in the SIGOT call. And after that, when we discussed, the thought process was supporting caching so that disconnected scenarios would work on the driver, would violate some of the
Nish,
Uh-huh.
are you recording?
Yeah.
Oh, you are. Sorry. I couldn't see it. I was like, oh, wait, did we forget to record? Never mind. Sorry.
No. So yeah, and then post we got call, like we had discussions, and then the thought process was supporting caching on the CSI driver would violate like node isolation, and because of all those concerns, we decided not to support disconnected scenarios with the driver. And like Andrea said, what we're going to do is the driver is going to do what it was intended for initially, which is just mount the secrets as volume, and that is it. And second part of that change is splitting the controller out. So today we have the sync as Kubernetes secret controller tied closely to the driver. And if you want to sync as Kubernetes secret, you also have to mount as volume, which is not a desirable experience. So like this proposal basically is talking about splitting that controller out from the CSI driver and then running that as a standalone thing. And on a very high level, it's basically a deployment which has like 2 pods maybe. And the way we are thinking it would work is like providers don't have to make any changes, but we take the provider pods and then just add them as sidecars into the controller pod. And the requests that are generated to say like, hey, go get these secrets from external key vault or like secrets manager and all of that would stay exactly the same as what it was with CSI driver. So like we're going to be reusing the proto, and we are also keeping the secret provider class. So if you're a user, you define the same secret provider class, but we are introducing a new secret sync custom resource, which is a wrapper on top of secret provider class, in which you reference the secret provider class that you want to use. And then you also tell which service account or like which auth you want to use for going and fetching these secrets from Key Vault. And like this is an example of the secret sync class. So like basically service account name says use this service account, generate a token, and pass that on to the providers. And then whatever is in the secret provider class, the way the driver passes it to the provider today, the controller will pass the same details to the provider. And from the provider perspective, it won't know who is calling it, whether it's the driver or the controller. Like it already has been developed for this set of protocols, so there should be no changes. But one thing I want to bring up is because this change means we have a standalone project that's syncing as Kubernetes secret. Before we add the provider pods in the Helm chart or any of that, like provider containers, like we wouldn't like need providers to opt in. So we basically need to build that consensus. Like I think like so far, like with Azure, we are comfortable with adding it. But I think like Amit for Google, like we're going to ask you for it, and then like for HashiCorp and like other providers that are out there today, we need to basically get yes before we actually add that sidecar.
So Anish, firstly, thanks for providing this background context, right? So I have a question there. So this so I'm imagining there's going to be a Helm chart that will install the sync controller, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the provider container is going to be a sidecar in that pod for the sync controller.
Yes, because today, if you look at it, the driver and providers are run as daemon sets, right? So it's
Right.
basically running on every single node, and communication is through UDS. And if we want to follow the same model, like we still want to use UDS, because this is a deployment pod, like it's just a single controller, like we would need to package the providers as sidecars so that like it can still just talk on the UDS within that pod.
Okay.
So if you look at this example, right, like this is from the POC. So basically, if you see, this is a deployment. And in the deployment, if you look at containers, like the first container is like the secret store controller container. And then in addition to that, we also have like the provider Azure container. So basically, like in the Helm chart, we can have every provider container, but it won't be enabled by default. So basically, we can say when you install the Helm chart, you can choose which providers that you want to install with the controller pod.
Okay, so I may not be super familiar with these communication protocols, but then can't we do it in the same fashion as the driver and provider, where they are installed like separately?
The problem with this is because it's a single controller, right? Like it's going to land on any node, and then you would need to have the provider running exactly on the same node because it's just a file system, right? Like Unix domain socket. So both the provider and the controller need to run on same node. So you basically have to add like affinity, and even with affinity, like if you have
Got
multiple,
it.
it could land on different nodes.
I see. And we don't want to make this controller a daemon set, I assume.
So we are basically moving away from all of that because it's an overkill, right? Like even today, like the sync controller only needs to be like a single controller, but because it's baked into the CSI driver, it's just running multiple copies on it of every node. But if you look at it on what it needs to do, all it needs to do is react when a secret sync custom resource is created, and then go and perform actions, and then just create a Kubernetes secret. That's it. So it just needs to be a single controller.
Got it. The other thing that I was thinking is, let's say once this is implemented and someone installs the sync controller with a provider of their choice, and they also have the driver and provider for the usual CSI volume mount kind of a thing. Would that kind of cause any issues with like provider running both as part of this the sync controller sidecar and its own daemon set? I assume that should be fine.
Yeah, it should be fine because, like, in case of the controller, the provider is running as a sidecar, right? So, like, everything is within that pod. And then in terms of
Yeah.
like the driver deployment and the provider as a daemon set deployment, like, it's a totally different model. So, like, they both should never conflict.
Uh, okay, yeah, that seems reasonable to me. Um, okay, let me maybe switch gears and ask you about something that you said earlier, right? So, so you mentioned that the caching project regarding that, right? There were some concerns raised, etc. So, are we saying that we are not pursuing that anymore, or would that be part of the sync controller?
So we are saying we are not pursuing that anymore. So basically, we are not doing any changes on the CSI driver to add capability to supporting disconnected scenarios. But
Okay.
instead, if someone wants to consume secrets from external secret store in disconnected model, they can basically use our new sync controller, sync that external secrets is Kubernetes secret, and then just use that Kubernetes secret when they are offline.
Got it. Got it. Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I
Yeah,
think
that clarifies it. Yeah.
Mo has his hand.
And that kind of works, assuming that the sync class hasn't been removed because the life of the secret would be tied to the sync class.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Yeah. Uh, Mo, please go ahead. Yeah.
So I was going to ask on that earlier conversation where we were talking about the deployment. So Anish, you and I were recently playing with Spire and stuff, right? And in the Helm chart of Spire, I remember they had this concept of like extra containers and extra volume mounts and extra init containers and all these things. Could we, like as basically the SIGAUT community, stay out of the business of including anybody else's by just having like, a generic extra providers field, or like providers field. It doesn't have to be extra because you have to have some. And it would be a required thing where you have to provide the YAML in your helms.values thing that actually adds the provider.
So we can do it. So like today, even for the driver, right? Like the most of the providers, what they do is they take the driver Helm charts and then like bake it as a dependency and then modify on top of it to add their own stuff, like modify images, and then like also like deploy the provider with it. So we can do this, but the only thing is with this model, like the documentation needs to be spread out across different providers, like how it is with driver today. So if you want to use a sync controller and you want to use like Key Vault, you would need to go to like the repo where that Key Vault documentation and Helm charts are to say like, oh, okay, I need to add this container. This is the argument. These are the set of things that needs to be added.
Right. But I guess is that different in any way than today?
Like today, so I think like we've already developed that model where users know the driver is generic and they just have to go to different providers to install. But with the controller, I think the only thing is like the sidecar part of it, which could be a little difficult. Like today, if you have to install Azure provider, Vault provider, you just install 2 daemon sets. But they need to understand that they need to update that single pod, add these sidecar containers and all of that. And also we would need every provider to add documentation and like all these YAML stubs in their repo to say like, this is how you do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, I feel like if we had this centralized Helm chart, which no one has to use, they could still keep following the model where they go to a provider and the provider just says, here's the Helm chart with the controller and my thing in it. Just use that if you don't need that. I don't know. I feel like I would feel better if we just had a place where we had our Helm chart and then we just linked out to all the providers that had told us that they support this mode to their stubs. Because then it's just like, okay, take these Helm.values, insert them together. And then when you run our Helm chart with these extra things, it will work. I'm just really wary about having everybody's stuff in our repo, basically. Because then, like, for example, if like the Azure provider changes and there's like a new flag you're supposed to set, then we have to go to like the main repo to set it, and then everybody else also has to do that, and that just seems weird.
Yeah, like that is one concern definitely, because like every time even there's a new release and stuff, right? Like you would need to come and update it here, and like that is definitely a concern. Like the only thing is if each provider keeps it on their own, like I think it will be on the provider to decide if they want to like have their own repo and all of that basically. Like I think that is something we need to get feedback on. Because for us, this is becoming a net new project. So like, do each provider want this as a net new project where they just reference the Helm chart and say like, hey, if you want to sync, this is it and all of it, like how they want to handle it?
I mean, they don't have to have it net new, right? They could just say that we're not going to make any new Helm charts. If you want to use our provider with the Helm chart that's provided by the upstream, just add this and you're done. And you'll call our image that already exists and with the right config, and you can come back here whenever you want to do an upgrade to a newer provider version, because you'll give you new YAML if it's different.
Yeah, I think like that should be fine. Sorry, Nilek.
Yeah, I think it's. I wanted to ask on the similar notes, right? And I think we discussed this before, but how are we gonna handle the failure mode? So, for example, like there are like two providers, let's say Azure and Google, and Azure has problem, then it might end up restarting the whole pod just because Azure has a problem, right? So is there a, like, do we have any thoughts around it, like how we are going to handle the failure of one particular provider?
Doesn't each container have its own health checks and its own, I forget exactly, like you can have partial failure of a pod, right? And it can kind of keep limping along if you wanted to do that.
Yeah, I think if the container fails, only that container will keep restarting, but the pod should still be running.
I mean, it is a good thing to have like probably like test around, right? Like one broken provider and one functioning one. Can you still use the functioning one through the controller? But that would be my expectation, is that if you have more than one provider, as long as one of them is functioning, you should be able to use that one, and the rest should be in whatever broken state. And because the controller is syncing to secrets, then even if a provider is broken, if it already synced some data, it should be fine. That data should stay there, and there should be no disruptions. Like it's not like the driver where a lot of things can go awry if you can't, at the instant of pod start, have everything ready.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds reasonable, I guess. And I guess we can make it work.
I suspect we will, if we allow like, insertion into our Helm chart of basically arbitrary YAML for containers, we would probably have to provide some like guidance, like do it like this or don't do it like this, or something. So that way people don't just put horrible things in there and just break the whole pod with one failing provider.
But yeah, I think the idea is good. Like just having that extra containers thing might work. And it's also good because, yeah, if they explicitly opt into this model, then they will have documentation on what needs to be injected. So,
right.
So if we go with the centralized model, right, where the Helm chart of the controller has references to various providers, uh, so every time a provider sees a new release, someone will have to go and bump it up there, right?
yeah,
That might,
good.
which is, I think that the failure thing is fine. Like, let's say one of the providers just had a bad release, and I think based on what we just discussed, it's probably okay that provider will keep crashing. But then, whom do we sort of give that responsibility to go and update the central Helm chart? I think it would be on the provider then to make sure that whenever they do a release, they just also go and update the central Helm chart.
Yeah, I think that's the concern that Mo was bringing up, right? Like if
Yeah.
you have all of it in one Helm chart, then yeah, like every time there's some change, like provider would need to come update it, and then like we would have CI around it saying like, hey, this works, you didn't break anything and all that before we cut a release of the YAML. But
Yeah.
if we rely on the model that Mo was suggesting, where the Helm chart on the controller side just has a controller sidecar, and then for it gives you an extensibility point for other containers that can be added. So like the extra containers, and you can basically put in like YAML blobs to say like I want to add this container, another container. So like GCP would have documentation on what is the minimal container spec that's required to be added to the YAML, and similarly Azure would have it. And if I'm a user, I would take that Helm chart and then in my values.yaml add all these other sidecar containers that I need, and then I would just deploy it.
Yeah, so I think from a CI perspective, right, the decentralized model might actually work better because uh, let's say there's an Azure provider and the maintainers of the Azure provider might be the best people to write E2E tests or something to make sure that the sync controller indeed works with the Azure provider, and similarly for every other vendor, right? If you put it in the central repo, getting all the end-to-end tests in one place, it will also need setups and accounts and service tokens and whatnot, so might
Yeah.
become a big problem.
Yeah, definitely. Like, so for the same reason, even on the driver today, like we developed this E2E provider, right? So like, so that we
Yeah.
can test the driver functionality works, and then it's on the providers to make sure that like the things that they do specifically, like they test it out. Like Azure tests out like workload entity, like other auth stuff it provides, and then GCP also has like its own set of tests and everything.
Yeah.
So I think the model would be the same. For the controller, we would just have like an E2E provider, or we could reuse the existing E2E provider too. Like that's the good part. that we have for the driver. So we would just reuse it.
Yeah,
And
the
then,
interface doesn't change.
right. Yeah. But like Amit, like not to put you on the spot, but based on these discussions, like, do you think GCP would be willing to opt in for the sync controller one?
Yeah, I don't see any red flags off the top of my head. Uh, I'll request my colleagues to also take a look. Uh, but yeah, at least as of now, I don't see any red flags.
Okay.
One thing I wanted to mention also, it's probably somewhere in this doc. I haven't looked at this version of the doc yet. Like one of the strong motivating factors from like my side is getting the driver into a much more hardened state. So today, if you use the secret sync feature, you completely break node isolation. But also, if you use the secret rotation feature, you also completely break node isolation. And the reason for this is because the driver is a daemon set, it runs on all your kubelets. It even runs on your Windows kubelets because it supports Windows if you want to run it there. What that means is any permissions that we grant to the driver, we effectively grant to all kubelets, right? And the secret sync feature grants incredibly broad secret permissions, which completely destroys most things. But then also the secret rotation feature today grants the ability to ask for any service account token, which also breaks node isolation. So by moving to this controller, we can have the more scary features not be a daemon set. So that way, for example, if you want to run this controller on a special node that is like a system node or whatever you want to call it, then you isolate the privilege to that node instead of all of your nodes, right? I know in some environments people don't care about node isolation, right? But by default, you shouldn't make like the whole point of the project was to make you more secure, not less secure. So I think at the end of this, we will get there. Now, it will take a long time. I have no doubts about that. But having this controller, I think, sets us up for a nice path. Andre, I see you have your hand.
On a bit of a different topic, will we still support environment variables with the CSI driver once we remove the synchronization feature?
So so I think with Kubernetes secret, like users will continue to just do what they do today, right? So basically, once they have the Kubernetes secret, they will reference that in the environment variables and then consume it that way. But I think once we do the split and finish the first step, like there was this other issue that Mo created, right? Like basically with the DRA. So like that is something that we can pursue and see if we could support environment variables even without Kubernetes secret.
Yeah, and for folks' information, DRA is dynamic resource allocation, which obviously has nothing to do with secrets. However, just like CSI has nothing to do with secrets, but we can abuse it to get secrets into pods, DRA is a kubelet feature that just happens to have the capability of dynamically setting environment variables on containers. And as far as I understand, the files and stuff that it's using to inject those environment variables are like as secure as anything else that the kubelet can do. So that would be another mechanism for us to pursue. And if we had that, then I think we're basically at that point down to the only reason someone needs the secret sync controller is if they want to have like offline durability, or if they have to support an ingress controller or similar component that requires a Kubernetes reference to a secret. But that would give us a really nice, it would put us in a really nice place where basically when you need the controller, you need it, but otherwise, like, you don't. So.
Okay. In terms of next step for this doc, I think we'll probably update this doc a little bit more, but do we want to have a conversation about this in the next SIGOT?
Yeah, it's on the agenda.
Okay.
So we should.
Cool. No other things. We can go to the next one. I think Amit, you added this one.
Yes, I did add that one. Yeah, so I just wanted to let everyone know about this ticket. So someone has reported a bunch of vulnerabilities on the GCP provider, but I believe a bunch of these are also applicable to the driver. Uh, so we have been trying to fix some of the ones which are on the GCP provider, but uh, I think like the seccom profile and the app armor thing, I don't think that's set on the driver too. So it might be like we might fix the provider side of things, but I mean, in general, it is good if we can also start fixing these on the driver. Uh, Someone else might also run into these issues, and I think these are all valid findings.
Yeah, I think the privileged containers, we needed it because of the mount capability. Like I
Yeah,
did
yeah.
try just having one of those capabilities. I forgot which one, but that didn't work. The mount
Yeah.
propagation is bidirectional because we need to write to the file systems, like for the varlib kubelet pods.
Yeah, I think the network namespace sharing could probably be disabled on the driver, maybe.
Uh, we
The
did not
first one,
run on
perhaps.
host network in the driver. The driver does not run on host network.
Okay, so that's probably already disabled then. I
Yeah.
mean, there's no sharing then.
Yeah, I'm not saying there isn't things we can't harden on the driver, but I think the gist of it comes down to is the driver does privilegey things.
Uh, yeah, I agree.
I mean, like you can't fix all of them because it won't work anymore.
For
Now,
sure.
the controller should basically have none of these issues because the controller should basically be able to run with all capabilities dropped and just this is going to be messing with local files and its local pod namespace and pod file system, so it should just be fine. But yeah,
Yeah, so while we fix it on the GCP provider, we'll try to send some PRs on the way on the driver if we think something can be fixed. Just letting you guys know.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. That is all in the discussion items. Is there anything else that anyone else wants to discuss? No?
Please add your name on the attendee list if you have not already.
Yeah. Cool. Then I think that is it. I think we'll see all these folks on the SIGOT call next Wednesday, so we can discuss the proposal more.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you
Sounds
all.
good.
Bye bye.
Good day, everyone.